record. There we go. Recording this meeting, so you have to accept in order to stay. So as I said, we have Brian Canepa, who will be presenting on AB 2097 and how it affects parking and our industry. As always, I just have a couple of quick announcements. So our next meeting next month, we were struggling to find ourselves a speaker, so we will be moving that topic to our May meeting. And instead for March, we'll be having a happy hour on March 23rd at 5 p.m. Location is to be determined, but it'll be near a BART station in Oakland. In April, we'll be doing, as always, our student research presentations featuring potentially students from Cal, Stanford, and San Jose State. Exact topics and speakers to be determined. And as I said, in May, we'll return back to having our standard research, our standard professional presentations. I also wanted to give a plug for the NorCal section. We'll be having their annual vendors night in March on the 16th from 2 to 8 p.m. in Lodi. Registration link is to come, but at least for now, you can have that save the date. And then real quick, I'm going to turn it over to Mark. Mark, if you have any announcements on behalf of the Western District.
Sure, thank you, Kevin. Just a couple quick ITE announcements. We did have the Western District Student Traffic Bowl about 2 weeks ago, and Cal put in a pretty good showing on behalf of our local Bay Area section, but they came up just short. Oregon State is actually going to be the Western District representative, which leads to the next item. This weekend, the Western District will be hosting, I believe it's the 8th Student Leadership Summit in that series. It's going to be at USC, and it's co-hosted by UC Irvine and UCLA. And I know several professionals who will be participating. Several of the consultant firms are sponsoring, and it's a good opportunity to meet a lot of students. Hopefully look for new interns and new hires, which many of us are doing. And this summer, probably the most important thing is the joint meeting, the annual meeting. The Western District annual meeting will be a joint meeting with ITE International, and that will be in Portland in August. And I had an opportunity to view the venue and talked with the local committee as well as the ITE International folks who are organizing this. They're expecting a very big turnout. There was a very strong submittal for the number of abstracts. And so a lot of folks did not make the cut with some very good presentation ideas. So it's going to be a well-rounded program, and it's going to be a pretty good overall annual meeting. So hopefully I'll see a lot of you in Portland this summer. The registration for that will be coming out shortly. There is a spring technical conference happening in a few weeks. Those who are ITE members have seen announcements about that. So you can take a look for that. But and that's virtual, so pretty easy to do. And that's really it on the ITE announcement front. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Just on that last point, one thing that I was reminded of this morning from ITE HQ is that the last day for early bird registration for that virtual meeting is either today or tomorrow, but either way, it's soon. So if that is at all of interest, make sure you check that out quickly. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that way we can do just a quick social media moment. This is something we like to do to kind of help promote the section. So if you would mind turning on your cameras and just giving a quick wave, then we'll take a picture, say hi, and move on to our feature presentation. So everyone ready? Say hi. Okay, thank you all. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brian. Brian, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. All right, no more waving. No. All right. Now down to business here. Thank you all for having me here today. I'll share my screen, and I will apologize up front if my voice sounds a little funny. I do have a cold, so please bear with me if through any coughing and things of that sort. But Kevin, can you see my screen okay?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Okay, great. Sorry, I wasn't getting my typical border up there. So anyway, again, Brian Canepa from W-Trans. I head up our parking practice for the firm, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about AB 2097, which is, as I call it, the brave new parking world, because legislation in itself is not mysterious, but this certainly detailed piece of legislation has profound impacts across the state, and is a great topic to get into. So I will also apologize up front because this is a legislative update. This is a very text-heavy presentation. Normally, I don't do text, such heavy text, but because the words here are really critical, and I want to be able to cite as much as possible for everyone's benefit. I can figure out how to advance the slide. It would be nice. There we go. All right, so what is AB 2097? So broadly speaking, it prohibits agencies from imposing requirements on most development projects within a half a mile of major transit. And, it's came into effect January 1st. This has been in the works for quite some time. There were previous iterations of this legislation and previous sessions of the assembly that failed, but this one made it through. But this is not, I wouldn't say this is a standalone piece of legislation. For those of you who are familiar with what's going on in California, there have been several pieces of legislation passed within, particularly the past 5 years, that have largely been driven by the demand for housing, especially affordable housing in the state, that have parking impacts. So you have AB 2030-45, which is the density bonus law, affects parking requirements. You have SB 9, which allows subdivisions of the lots that affect parking. You have AB 2011, which allows for ministerial by right approval for affordable housing in mixed use areas. So there's a lot going on that with housing legislation that has directly impacted parking. For my purposes, at least, the density bonus law has played into a lot of projects lately that I've had, or in the past couple of years. In addition to that, as you all, I'm sure know, SB 743, completely changed the way CEQA, interpreted transportation impacts, shifting from LOS to VMT, and screening out most projects, I should say, within half a mile of major transit. I'm going to get to that in a second. You say, why is that relevant? Well, hold on to your pants. And lastly, I would say that, there is a good amount of data out there. I'll kind of make a pitch for this because I find it kind of useful in terms of parking generation. So Transform has a great green trip parking database for those of you who are not familiar with it. If you're looking for good parking data about built uses in the Bay Area that are up and running and they have data collected for it, you can see here on my screen, this is an example of one down San Jose. And they actually, when you go to the website, it will detail individual developments, how many parking spaces there are. They've actually done parking counts there to see peak parking. They have listings of TDM programs. And so I wanted to throw that out there. It's a great resource to see, if you're curious to see what's kind of been built to date prior to this legislation. It gives you some good background. So, okay, I told you broadly what the legislation does. Now we're going to kind of dig into the weeds here because there are quite a few of them. So as I mentioned, this project essentially prohibits agencies from imposing minimum parking requirements for most projects within half a mile of major transit stop. And then so the first question you ask is, well, what's a major transit stop? How do you define that? Because the devil's always in the details on these things. So this legislation defines major transit stop as anything that is rail, bus rapid transit, or ferry, regardless of your level of service. You could have one ferry a day and it still counts as a major transit stop. Or the intersection of 2 or more bus routes with frequencies that are 15 minutes or faster in the AM and PM peak commute periods. So just I'll clarify that for a second, because I find there's quite a bit of confusion among consultants and clients on this issue, that if you have one bus route there and it comes every minute, that doesn't count. If you have 100 bus routes and they come every 20 minutes, that also doesn't count. You have to have at least 2+ bus routes with a frequency of that's greater than 15 minutes. In addition to all these other rail, BRT, and ferry. Now, the legislation also kind of drops in there very subtly that this applies to both existing major transit stops and those listed in the RTP and the Regional Transportation Plan. So MTC has their RTP is publicly accessible. You can go on their GIS files, which I'll show you in a second. And so it's not only things that are existing, it's everything that's planned in the future. So even if there's nothing there on the site right now, so long as it's listed in the RTP, it still falls under AB 2097 in terms of parking requirements. Now, I said also this applies to most projects. It does not apply to hotels unless they have an odd provision, unless you have at least 6+ units for resident guests, because now hotels sometimes have certain units for actual full-time residents. Event centers, where you still require employee parking. And then they also threw a provision in there that commercial requirements that were via agency agreement prior to January 1, 2023. So I suspect that provision is probably not often used, and as time goes on, will be less so. I will mention too that this half mile, when they say half mile, this is a half mile radius. It is a perfect circle. My hands are kind of disappearing here, but a circle around each of these major transit stops. There are other pieces of legislation that have been passed by the assembly that specifically call out that as a half mile walking distance or something of those sorts. So again, this is a half mile radius. If you need to look up major transit stop and how that's defined, you can look in Public Resources Code 21155 if you're really interested. But this is what it looks like at the end of the day. And I apologize, I didn't get the full Bay Area. I mean, I'm up in Sonoma County and I've chopped off Sonoma County. But what it's showing essentially is the layer of major transit stops provided by MTC with a half mile radii around each of those stops. And as you can see, I mean, certain parts of the Bay Area are exactly what you would expect. San Francisco is essentially covered with this. So minimum parking requirements will basically not apply citywide. Down in San Jose, it's heavily covered. Up and down the peninsula on El Camino Real and in the East Bay and along BART stations. One thing I will note though too is that, excuse me, like if you take the North Bay or other places, you know, there are smart rail stations that have it, but also places that you might not intuitively think of, like Sausalito or Tiburon, because they have ferry terminals. So it's going to be interesting as the legislation, as the time period goes on, because, for example, downtown Sausalito right now has no more minimum parking requirements. I'm not sure if many people are aware of that. I think people are more used to seeing this be effective in more urban areas, but it does play into other communities as well. So getting back then to this idea about major transit stop and why I brought up SB 743. So for those of you who are familiar with SB 743, if you are within half mile of transit, people normally say, you can screen out of VMT for the purposes of trying to meet that requirement. But how they define transit is different. And we've run into this more recently where people have assumed that, well, half mile transit is half mile transit, regardless of whether it applies to VMT or for AB 2097. And that's not the case, unfortunately. As I mentioned, AB 2097, you know, as I defined before, you have rail, BRT, ferry, you have your 2+ major bus routes, and it applies to existing and those in the RTP. SB 743 is actually major transit stop and high quality transit corridor. So a high quality transit corridor is anything that has fixed route bus service, apologies, with frequencies of 15 minutes or greater during the peak commute periods. So, you know, we ran into this one project relatively recently on the peninsula where AB 2097 actually, it did not screen out for AB 2097, but it did screen out for SB 743 because of the bus schedules that were in effect there. So again, just something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind too, when you're calculating radii for AB 2097 is if the radius cuts through the site, no more than 25% of the site can be outside that radius for it to count. So if half the site is outside the radius, it doesn't count. If 10% is outside the radius, it does count. So there are ways to measure that if it happens to slice right through. So, on the face of it, this seems relatively simple, because I'm sure all of you are thinking, oh, it's so easy. But they do have a provision in here, which was actually added in the late stages of this legislation, I'm assuming by members of the Assembly or Senate who are more worried about the impacts of this, about, well, what if we need to apply minimum parking requirements in certain cases? So there is a provision that says, hey, agencies, you can apply these minimum parking requirements if within 30 days of a completed application that you have written findings that are, and I have this italicized here, supported by a preponderance of evidence in the record that having no minimum parking requirements will have a substantially negative effect on either your ability to have essentially affordable housing, your ability to have either senior or disabled housing, or impacting residential or commercial parking within a half a mile of the housing development. So there's a lot of ifs in there. And this is a very high bar they set, because what it means is within 30 days of a completed application, that's a very tight window. You have to prove that you already had evidence in the record that showed that there was a parking problem in this area, or that it will somehow affect your affordable housing or senior housing or disabled housing needs. And you think, okay, gosh, well, maybe that comes up occasionally. It could. I mean, theoretically, if you ever have the parking report in hand and they do it. I recently had a project where they said, gosh, this is great, but the complete application was a year ago, so this is well outside the time frame. But let's assume for a second that it is within the time frame, within 30 days. Well, this only can apply to certain development projects. If it is a housing development and it's at least 20% affordable housing, no matter whether it's very low, moderate income, student, elderly, disabled, if it's at least 20%, there is no way to apply the minimum parking requirements. If it has fewer than 20 units, you cannot apply the minimum parking requirements. If there are parking requirements that are allowed by other laws, like let's say the density bonus law, those still apply. You can't simply ignore other laws. Those will still apply in that case, and you can't exceed those. So again, particularly when it comes to housing, the bar is set very, very high to actually impose minimum parking requirements. And I wanted to make that distinction. I wanted to draw it a little earlier too, because a lot of the intent of this legislation, yes, it's about parking. Yes, it's about VMT reduction and greenhouse gas reduction, but this is also really a bill about housing, and specifically about affordable housing, because you can see in these provisions that they don't have the same outs for commercial development as they do for affordable housing. And I believe that some communities, many communities probably haven't really woken up to the fact that when it comes to these sorts of requirements, their hands are going to be tied. As I mentioned too, the devil's in the details on these things, because there's additional details, there always are. One is that this legislation doesn't apply to any electrical vehicle equipment requirements that may be minimum requirements that might be there, or disabled parking requirements, right? So Cal Green has very extensive electric vehicle parking requirements, which drive me absolutely batty, but they're there for a good reason. And they said, gosh, those can still apply. Same thing for disabled parking requirements. Now, here's where it also gets a little interesting. If a development provides parking voluntarily, right? So you build a development, whatever the case happens to be, and you say, gosh, I'm going to provide 50 parking spaces, even though your minimum requirement is 0. The agency can require that the development either A, provide spaces for car share vehicles, B, that parking in part or in whole be shared with the public, so essentially made publicly accessible. You can't keep it reserved for your private users, or C, have it be charged, so you have actually priced parking. Now, the legislation doesn't say that agencies have to do this, and I suspect that many agencies will opt not to, but agencies do have that flexibility, and it gives them more leverage, I believe, if they don't want developments to provide a lot of parking. And lastly, too, is that if someone does provide parking voluntarily, I say I'm going to build affordable housing or some housing development, I'm going to have 100 units and I'm going to have 100 parking spaces. The agency can't require that I make those spaces free. If I want to price those spaces, it's my right as a developer to be able to do that. And they specifically put that in there to avoid situations where cities were trying to kind of do an end run around the legislation by essentially mandating free parking in these areas. So that's the legislation in a nutshell. There is, as I mentioned, there is a lot of small details in there. It's not a lengthy piece of legislation, but there are, there's caveats and questions. So happy to speak to any questions that are out there or address any comments. I don't know, Kevin, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that. I was just going to say, typically we ask people to put any questions in the chat, and then we can answer them in the order in which they're received. If you would prefer to speak, then just please raise your hand. While those questions are coming up, I'll go ahead and ask one just to get the ball rolling. So for the accessible space requirement, let's say if this law didn't exist, there was a requirement for a complex to have, say, 100 parking spaces total, which requires 4 accessible spaces. With this law, if that complex decides to provide no parking at all, would they still be required to provide those 4 spaces that they would have had to require per the requirement or provide per the requirement, or can they just provide no spaces at all, accessible or otherwise?
It's a good question, actually. It's again, I'll caveat this. I'm not a lawyer. I play one on TV. So I can't actually say how this would work out in court, because the way the disabled parking requirement actually reads is that the number of your disabled spaces that you're required to provide are dependent on how many spaces total you provide. So based on that read of it, I would say that essentially, if you choose to build parking, then you have to have some of that be disabled, but you don't have to build, for example, 4 disabled spaces because you may have otherwise provided 100 parking spaces. Does that answer your question? Does that make sense? Okay.
I think so.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen any questions come in. Oh, there's one. Can I get a copy of your presentation?
Yes, of course. Happy to give him a copy of the presentation. I assume that's a standard thing. That I apologize, everyone. This is my first time coming to one of these meetings. I'm a relatively new ITE member. But yeah, happy to share the presentation. Happy to answer questions also after this meeting. If people just like to talk shop, obviously you can tell I'm pretty enamored with the subject.
Yeah, so thanks for that. We can feel free to either email Brian at his email there for a presentation, or send me an email or a message and I can get you a copy as well. I guess I don't see any other questions, but another one that I know has come up is a lot of cities base their minimum bicycle parking requirements on minimum vehicle parking requirements. And so if a project is exempt and therefore doesn't have minimum vehicle parking requirements, in your experience, does that also eliminate the need for minimum bicycle parking requirements, or is that some other ballpark entirely?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I've actually seen a lot of cities get away from that over the years in terms of tying your bicycle parking requirements to your vehicle parking requirements. So the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals, has their own recommended guidelines of saying, gosh, you have so many residential units, you have so many commercial space, et cetera. This is how many long and short-term bicycle parking spaces you should be providing. So in my experience, more cities have gone to that model of saying bicycle parking requirements are there in their own right, not necessarily related to vehicle, but that if you have that within a particular code that says, according to the code is, you are required to provide 100 parking spaces and hence 10 bicycle parking spaces. This legislation actually doesn't speak to the bicycle parking spaces at all. Again, that would be something I think that would be open to legal interpretation, but that ultimately probably won't be too contentious, simply because bicycle parking is so cheap to provide most of the time. And I suspect that most cities would still try to require it, even if it is tied to vehicle parking requirements.
Great, thanks. We have a question in from Justin Meek. He asks, can you repeat the distinction between AB 2097 and Senate Bill 743?
Yes, let me All right, let me go back up here a little bit. Oh, there we go. So the distinction, sorry, the distinction is the one distinction I was trying to draw. I mean, these are two different pieces of legislation, right? One applies to parking requirements and the other applies to VMT and how projects screen out. Because under SB 743, it's not only a major transit stop, they have a major transit stop and a high quality transit corridor. So I would say the bar is set lower to screen out, so to speak, because if you have even one bus that's running at 12 minutes, and that's the only bus that's running along there, you essentially screen out. That counts as a major transit stop. That's not the case under AB 2097, where particularly with bus service, having two major bus lines running at frequencies greater than 15 minutes in the AM and PM peaks is, generally indicative of a more urban area. You're not going to see that in many other areas. One other distinction too, I don't know why they did this, probably just sloppy legislative writing, is that in 2097, they actually specifically define the peaks as AM and PM peak commute periods. Under SB 743 in the high quality transit corridor, they actually don't define them as AM and PM peak periods. So theoretically, those peak periods could be something different. If you only had it in the morning, or only had it in the afternoon. But again, that would be, I think, a stretch for most people to do.
Great, thank you. We have a question that came in from Molly Riddle, which asks, we received some questions from clients about how AB 2097 would impact VMT screening criteria, which currently reference parking minimums. If parking minimums no longer apply, that screening criteria no longer applies. Can you please speak to this, or whether there are any anticipated changes to these VMT screening criteria?
Right. So I think, Molly, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're referring to is the fact that you screen out if we're within a half a mile, except, for example, if you provide more parking than what is otherwise required, right? So you don't automatically screen out if you're in half a mile. You still could actually, it could apply to you if you're overproducing parking in this case. And so, I mean, my read on this, and again, this is only me acting as a non-lawyer here, but that if you do not have parking requirements within those half-mile areas, and the jurisdiction is not able to apply any, right? Because there are cases where they could, theoretically, although those are relatively limited, that would set the bar pretty low. So as soon as you start building parking, even though there is none required, because AB 2097 has said so, you've essentially eliminated your opportunity to screen out of VMT if you provide parking. Hopefully that made sense. So I'll just give an example. So if you have development somewhere on the peninsula and it's within, near Caltrain, and you say, okay, there's going to be no minimum parking requirements, but I'm going to choose to provide 50 parking spaces. Well, previously you might have screened out of VMT because you provided less than the minimum parking requirements. Now there are no minimum parking requirements, and you've essentially exceeded what there is, and as such, you no longer have to screen out. Again, that would be my interpretation of it. I wouldn't be surprised if that goes to court, just because it's not specifically addressed within AB 2097.
Great, thanks for that response. Another question just came in from Steve Coleman, who asks, is there any concern that AB 2097 may make it harder for transit operators to increase service if it would result in a corridor becoming a major transit corridor with an impact on a local agency's parking requirements? I can foresee citizen opposition to transit improvements if it would shift a corridor from non-major to major in the context of the law.
Absolutely. This actually occurred to me too. When this legislation went through, I was like, gosh, I really hope people don't use this as an excuse to block transit from entering their community, because they feel that once it does, their hands are tied and they won't be able to apply minimum parking requirements. I mean, at the end of the day, I like to think that not only bus services, it could apply to rail, it could apply to ferry, it could apply to BRT, right? Because as soon as you have one of those stations, there are no minimum parking requirements in that area. But yes, theoretically, could it be used that way? Absolutely. Do I hope that people don't? Yes, but then I also have seen the experience that we've gone through with CEQA and the misuse of environmental law. So I remain skeptical that people wouldn't use this as a tool to try to keep transit service out, or at least maybe not openly say that, but use that as a reason.
Thanks for that. If I may editorialize, I'm hoping, if anything, it does the opposite. In that, for example, Redwood City is trying to build a local light rail circulator, like a trolley circulator, which if that allows a lot of these exemptions to get granted, then maybe that would bring businesses on board and kind of build a business case for expanding transit options. But to get back to the questions being asked, we have a question in that says, I wonder if AB 2097, while a good measure to encourage use of transit, would increase demand to street parking, which is in some cases the argument to preclude development of protected street facility or protected bike facilities, because many a times removal of the street parking lane is needed for the implementation of such bike facilities. I wonder if there are studies on these cases and how the street parking is utilized after project implementation.
Yeah, actually, this is an excellent point, because we're working on a project. Let me just reread that thing. I want to make sure I'm addressing correctly. So, well, a good measure increase the street parking.
And while you're rereading that, that's from Aleida Andrino Chavez. Apologies for not mentioning your name before.
Yeah. Okay. So absolutely. So, we're again, like currently working on a project down the peninsula where they're looking at this and saying, gosh, we really want to be able to manipulate our parking requirements. A lot of the study area is going to be affected by 2097. And our recommendation right off the bat was to say, hey, this is great that we're doing this study, but you really need to study your on-street parking management, because that is going to be completely impacted by all of this, right? If most of the area screens out and all of a sudden your on-street parking is largely unregulated, that has the potential to cause some mayhem. Mayhem with a little m, not a big M. And yeah, I mean, that could affect then how decisions are made in terms of allocating street space. Do you do it? Do you allocate? Do people become that much more protective on street parking because they see it as a much more critical asset now that it's not there off street as much? And how does that affect the introduction of new bike facilities? There have been other places in the country that have done away with minimum parking requirements before and did not really do a great job of managing their on-street parking. There's some districts in Portland, Oregon in particular. You can look it up, I'm sure, online. They're pretty well documented, actually relatively recent articles too, I think from last year, basically that they received major pushback from local residents. They actually had to roll back their requirements. So they had no requirements and they had to roll them back and actually bring in requirements because on-street parking in particular got to be such a mess. So I absolutely think there's going to be some growing pains in this. And I think there's going to be a lot of education in communities realizing that the management of off-street parking is inherently tied to on-street parking. And that in itself, as you just brought up here, is tied to what type of transportation facilities you place on street.
Great, thank you. Justin Meek has a question asking, do you have any examples of, quote, other developments that have invoked AB 2097 to not provide parking on site?
I'm not really sure if Justin can clarify what we mean by other developments, or Kevin, do you know?
Sure. Well, that's, as I understand, that's the way the law reads, is housing, commercial, and other, and the only developments that are exempted are, as you noted before, hotels and things like that, which means seemingly any other type of development would be eligible for getting out from having to provide housing. I can just share that here locally in Watsonville, we have a potential high school that wants to add a sports facility and provide no housing in an area that already is impacted by parking. So this is a loaded question, but I'm curious in what experience, if any, you may have in seeing applicants come in and creatively want to apply this law to say that we don't want to provide parking because we have no space for it, and we're going to just use this law to justify doing so, irrespective of the impacts on the neighborhood.
Right. And to be honest, I mean, this legislation is so new. I mean, we're at February 23rd. It's been about 2 months that this has been effective. I actually haven't run into a project so far that's not just generally commercial or residential where it applied. That said, I mean, a lot of the other uses that could be out there, that's a kind of a unique use educational facilities, but again, that's probably one of the more prevalent other uses that I'm sure other communities are going to grapple with. You know, at W-Trans, we work with like a lot of wineries, but wineries are really not going to be largely affected by this in most cases. So I apologize. I don't really have good examples off the top of my head of that. I'd have to look into it. But I'm sure as time goes on from January 1st in the future, we're going to see a lot more of it.
Great, thanks. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to just read the question, unless you want to read it.
I was just going to say, Aleda is asking if you can share articles of the cases and mention cases you mentioned in Oregon to her previous question about parking minimums potentially conflicting with protected bicycle facilities.
I absolutely can. You know what I think might be the easiest thing for me to do is I will modify the presentation and include that in there after the end of the question slide with just some references. Not only in terms of articles, but if you want to look up, for example, like, you know, I mentioned public resources code, you know, 21155 and, you know, things like that. If you actually ever want to go and look up some of this actual detailed language, I think that would be helpful too. So I think that's a good thing in general for me to do, and I shall do it.
And speaking of, so I've had a request for the presentation, so I'm just sharing my email here. And if you would like a copy of this presentation, feel free to, again, either drop Brian or myself an email, and we can forward that once Brian adds that material. I think that is the end of the questions. If any others come in the next couple seconds here as I'm rambling, we can go ahead and address them. But otherwise, I think that's covered all of the ones that have been asked so far. So thank you everyone for coming and attending. Thank you, Brian, for your time and for this presentation. I think this is a really interesting topic that'll have a lot of impacts on our industry here to come.
Absolutely.
So with that, I think we so adjourn today. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you all.